the condition of British politics at the moment is pretty unhealthy. I mean, whichever views you have, it's not good. The whole Brexit debate has, in a way, sort of polluted the atmosphere. And it's had two practical consequences, one of which is that a lot of things that really matter are just being put on one side. I mean, there is this whole issue about how we deal with an ageing population and social care and issues of that kind. It's just been put on the back burner. Nobody wants to make difficult decisions. Nothing is being done. Or if you take the issues that I was heavily involved with, how do you create a strategy for industry that makes us more productive as a country? How do you get behind science? And, really critical issues. Nothing has been decided. It's all been put on the back burner. Or, how do you finance universities? Who pays for it? Big, difficult decisions, which we did tackle when we were in government, but they're now just being pushed back and pushed back. And the country is really just at a kind of standstill until this whole Brexit issue is resolved. And unfortunately, it will not be resolved quickly, because even under Theresa May's deal, whatever you think about it, the basic problem about our future relations with the European Union haven't been decided. What kind of relationship we want to have, whether it's close or distant, negotiating a new relationship, they haven't even begun. It's going to take a minimum of 2 years, maybe 5, maybe 10. And we're going to be endlessly arguing about this subject. It is potentially very, very difficult. And of course, the second big observation is that it is making people very bad-tempered. People are getting impatient, irritated. Friendships, families are getting divided in a rather uncomfortable way. I was reminded of this today. The Radio Cornwall thing, it's part of my job. People are aggressive, but that's my job to put up with it. But it was very striking that I got lots of calls. They were all from men, they were all angry, and they were all about my age rather than Andrew's age. And then when I went to the college, 200 sixth formers, utterly, completely different. And I actually felt rather sorry for them. There was a young man who wanted to make the case for Brexit, and he did it very well. But he was obviously on his own. He was in danger of being bullied, actually. And the contrast between generations is becoming quite painful, and it was reflected in the voting. I often make this point to people, that people say the Brexit vote was about geography, it was about London and Scotland versus everybody else, but it wasn't. It was actually very much a generation issue. I think 65% of over 65s voted to leave, about 65% of under 25s voted to stay, about 80% of 18-year-olds want to stay. That is the way in which our country is becoming polarised. We have got a deal. There is, I think, a general consensus amongst people like me, who are basically Remainers, and amongst the Brexit-inclined MPs as well, that it's not good. There is a sort of consensus that this is a bad deal. It's not a criticism of Theresa May, who is an admirable person and tenacious and all those things. She's probably got the best she could get, but it's disappointing in all kind of ways. The second point is that she acknowledged in Parliament yesterday, as did the Chancellor, that it is going to make us poorer. That, of course, there are much worse scenarios of just crashing out, but even the government's deal, which is quite moderate, is going to make the country poorer. She just accepted that, and her line was, well, it's what people voted for. I'm not sure they all did, but the government now accepts that the country will be poorer as a result. And that's, I think, now become a kind of consensus. And I think the third point is, well, how do we get out of this mess? The deal will almost certainly be voted down in Parliament in 10 days' time. The question is, where do we go from there? There will be a variety of options canvassed. The Labour Party is pushing for a general election. I don't think it will carry. I don't think anybody wants a general election. We've had 2 in the last few years. Doesn't really solve any problems. So, we are then going to get round to this issue about whether the best thing to do is to go back to the public and say, Are you happy with what the government's got, or would you rather stay within the economic union? I mean, I think that will be the question. And I think something like a 50% probability that that's what we'll finish up doing, and that's what I will be arguing for.
Later on, I meant to mention that I'm entitled to kind of collect these things when I go to Parliament. So I've actually got a copy of the withdrawal agreement. Indeed, I've even got the political declaration as well. Nice little document, which I thought at the end of the evening I might auction.
I do warn you, it's not a page turner.
Vince has read it. I mean,
well, I've written a novel, and I don't.
So I sit on the Integrated Territorial Investment Board, which basically makes the decisions over the current EU funding allocations. So I do get quite a bit of insight into how that European funding is administered. And I could talk for a long time about this, but I won't. But in summary, I think it's worth recognising that the funding is split into two parts. One is for economic development, for basically trying to address the issues of low salaries in Cornwall. So it is focused around trying to create more high salaried jobs, knowledge-based economies and better paid jobs. And of course, the reality is, that doesn't affect an awful lot of people. There's a lot of people in Cornwall who, after all this European funding, have just felt, well, it hasn't benefited me. So unless you're affected by that, you're going to think that the EU funding hasn't actually helped. And I think we have to recognise that. And I'm going to urge Adam Painter to pass that message on to Barnier during his meeting that's coming up, just to explain that we're not unthankful for EU support. It's just there are some people that haven't felt that it has benefited them. The other half of that funding, I mean, it's not exactly half, but the other part of the funding is the European Social Fund, and a lot of that funding actually goes into helping the poorest and the most disadvantaged people in society. However, you tend not to create a case study of the person that has just come out of prison for 3 times, on his third occasion out of prison, and was given some help to address some issues. You can't really go into detail about that, and you can't make case studies about a lot of the disadvantaged people that have been supported, because obviously you can't publicise people's situations a lot of the time. So people are actually just completely unaware about a lot of the work and the help and support that has been going in to help at a social level. And it's unfortunately that's just, it's a victim of its own. It's trying to do the right thing. It's trying to support people, but it's not trying. It can't use. It can't put them on posters as case studies. And finally, there is occasionally, I do hear quite often people saying, "Oh, the European funding rules are so complicated," and there are certainly business people that will say, "Oh, well, the EU funding actually," I say a small percentage of them will say, "Well, the problem is it's all EU. The EU rules are so complicated that it stops the money being spent effectively." I'm very close to all of those programs, and I can tell you it's not the EU rules, it's the fact that our government, our civil service, gold and platinum plates the rules. So they'll take the general rules from the EU, and then they'll create the most incredible bomb-proof bureaucratic system to make the application of these funds a lot more complicated than it needs to be. And in
case they're asked for the money back, basically.
Yes. But so what they do is they take this incredibly protective approach, and so the way in which the UK government, or it's the Department for Community Local Government, it's now the Ministry for Homes and Communities Local Government. The way that they actually administer the funding is actually puts people off. But when questioned about it, of course they say, "Oh, it's not us that's making it difficult. It's the EU," and the EU is then blamed by Anybody that says, well, you've got to fill in this incredibly complicated form, they then say, it's not us, it's Europe. Blame the EU on it. And for years, the EU has actually been blamed by the people that are administering the funding that's here to help Cornwall. And they have been done a real disservice.
In Cornwall, the business community has relied very heavily on European support. We've had lots of grants of actual cash to help us buy new computer systems, back office systems, things that would help us grow. We've had cash from Europe that would allow us to employ new people, as well as expertise that all the business support agencies give to new businesses. I couldn't have done it without all of that support, and my fear now is what's going to happen for the business community. It's a real issue for a business like Frugi. We sort of export nearly half of what we sell, a lot to Europe. And Germany is our biggest market outside. So for me, and my position within all of this is, yes, business does need certainty. I don't believe that Theresa May's deal she's putting forwards, it doesn't seem that it gives us any certainty beyond the next 2 years. We still don't know what we'll be dealing with. It's a blind leap of faith, I feel, going for that deal. However, a no deal would be worse. So again, I'm sorry to sound like a consensus, but my feeling is very much that we now know as a collective a lot more about what a Brexit means. I don't think that Boris and Michael Gove and Nigel Farage gave us a very clear expectation of what it would mean. So I think that now everybody's explored that a lot more. I think the people need to be asked the question again.
Question on the ballot paper. I mean, it should be, do you want the deal that the government has brought back, or do you want to remain within the European Union? Now, the hardline Brexiters will say, can't we please choose to have no deal and jump off a cliff? Well, I think many of us feel that would be seriously irresponsible. But nonetheless, if you do feel that we have to have all opinions aired, then it would be possible to have 3 questions and you rank them. That could be done in that way. But I think in order to provide the stability and security that business clearly wants, and I think most members of the public, I think that's playing with fire, actually. And we're better with the simple question, are you happy with what the government's negotiated, or would you rather stay in the European Union? I think most people would be happy with that. In terms of the process, to be quite frank, it's very unclear. The one certainty is that there will be a vote on the government's proposal, and the arithmetic now suggests that it will be defeated probably quite heavily. What then has to happen is the government goes away for 21 days, and if you do the counting, I think that takes you to January the 2nd. And then it's got to come back with an alternative idea. And we have no idea what Theresa May would come back with. She may say, well, I've made a few tweaks. Will you please vote on it again? Or she may withdraw it. We don't know. That's where the uncertainty lies. But at that point, when it comes back to Parliament, there will certainly be a major push from the opposition parties and from a lot of Conservatives who say that is the point at which we vote on whether to have a public vote.
I tend to take the view that if there is a strong view in Parliament that a no-deal Brexit amongst the Rees-Moggs and the Borises and that fraternity, they really want to push for it, then give it to them. And they may well fix it against themselves in the form that you describe. I know that the fear is that, of course, this will generate ongoing uncertainty, but hopefully it won't create uncertainty for very long, because we've had a lot of uncertainty over the last 2 years. But that would be under a preferential vote, 1, 2, 3. On the second point that Vince was making about immigration and the way in which the Brexit voters and that debate had seemed to emboldened the people who perhaps hold rather deep and dark views about immigration. The fact is that those people have been emboldened by the referendum already. A second referendum won't make it worse. A second referendum at least gives us a chance to heal the wounds which were created by that event.
This Article 50, which is passed by Parliament, it relates to the Lisbon Treaty. That's what, when people use that phrase, Article 50, that's what they're referring to. And that's what commits us at present to leave the European Union by the end of March, unless somebody does something else. Now, there is a question, would it help if it were postponed? So it gives people more chance to have another vote, it gives more chance to negotiate something slightly different. Well, I think the answer to that is it could be possible to postpone it by weeks, but not by months. I went to see Mr. Barnier a few weeks ago and asked him this question, and they are flexible enough and they're willing to be helpful, but the problem is if it takes us into June, we then get run into the European elections, and which are happening across Europe. We're no longer doing it. These elections are going to be very difficult. In France, there is the National Front, extreme movement attacking Macron. You have quite a fierce argument going on in Germany and Italy. And the governments do not want to have the Brexit issue complicating all of that, because they think it will fuel nationalism in their own country, and they're trying to get the matter out of the way one way or the other. So we would get a few extra weeks, but not months. In terms of the lady's question here about the benefits of membership for Cornwall specifically, I think one of the great ironies of all this is that the parts of the country that have actually done best out of it are the ones that are voting to leave, whereas London, I mean, I'm a Yorkshireman who's lived in Scotland, but I now have a London constituency. I mean, my constituency is heavily Remain, but actually London is probably going to experience the biggest damage, because the financial services industry, there is nothing for the financial services industry in this Brexit agreement. They're going to suffer terrible damage. The Londoners, well, a third of London is foreign, a lot of East Europeans as well as people from Asia and elsewhere. But people in London are quite relaxed about it. There isn't an anti-immigration movement in London. Whereas in Cornwall, you get the benefits in terms of the structural adjustment help. The Eastern Europeans who work here, as I understand it, mostly are relatively young, doing work in the hotel trade, in agriculture, food processing, keeping the economy going or helping, paying taxes. Yet here there's the greatest hostility to them. It's a strange. I mean, it affects. It's true in the north of England that the place that probably depends on the European Union more than any other is Sunderland, because their future is tied up with the car industry. And the Nissan plant is now French-owned. Their production operates on a supply system throughout Europe. The potential for it going down in Brexit is very high. The same is true of the West Midlands. But these are Brexit areas, even though they depend much more on the positive things about the European Union than London or Scotland. So it is a strange thing about Britain, that those areas that have most to lose appear to be more pro-Brexit than the areas like London.
For me, and for starting a business in Cornwall, definitely it's been amazing to have that extra support. I think because we're a sticky out long bit out into the sea, we can't get a wide range of expertise and help and things like everybody else can, because we just don't have it in a concentric circle around us, and it's a problem with recruitment and all of those sorts of things as well. So I just wonder now what Cornwall would vote now. I mean, that's the thing. Now that Cornwall knows a lot more, I know lots of people who voted Brexit just because they were a bit fed up with Europe, and they wanted to kick it up the backside a little bit, but they really, really didn't ever think it would happen.
Well, I spent quite a lot of my time in recent months actually engaging with people in the European Union. When I talk to them, it's not so much they're angry, they're just very baffled. They just don't understand what the British are doing. They think it's just wholly irrational, and they're just confused, and they think it's self-harming on the British side. But they are now taking quite a firm line. They say, look, if you people in Britain have decided to go, well, we really regret it, but okay, you're going. It's going to be, we're going to be very businesslike about it. And I have to say that the terms that the British have got from these negotiations is not very good. I mean, the European Union have been completely united, quite ruthless. The British have been divided, confused, coming to this at the very last minute, and almost every major argument that the British government's had with the European Union, they've lost. And that doesn't bode well for the future, because when we're out, we have no bargaining power at all. And there's a whole lot of issues like fishing, for example, that will now be decided in a way that is quite disadvantageous to Britain. So there is a lot of residual goodwill to Britain. We're not an unpopular country, but people are just rather sad and confused about why we've done this.
If we haven't got the support for businesses, we won't have the support for jobs. We won't be able to create those jobs for youngsters coming up, and so therefore I do think that under any sort of deal that is outside of us remaining in, that we are actually going to be doing our young people a disservice in terms of jobs. Tackling
poverty will be relatively more difficult if you're a poorer country. I don't mean absolutely poorer, but our growth will not be as rapid if we leave the European Union. So tackling poverty becomes more difficult. But whether or not we're in the European Union, it's something that we have to tackle and haven't done. There are some appalling concentrations of poverty, and I think the day before yesterday I met the Trussell Trust, who run food banks in Britain, and they're proliferating. It is a shocking story. And the two groups in particular, there are families with 3 or 4 children. They're working parents, but they're not earning enough, and so they're having to go to food banks, and the universal credit, as it's called, just isn't adequate. And the other group are disabled people, are often mentally ill, and they're not coping with this new testing system that they have for disabled people that's striking many of them off the benefit system. So, whether or not we have Brexit, we've got to focus on the poverty problem as an issue in itself. One of the things that I and my colleagues did on the budget was to vote against high earners having a higher tax threshold. I mean, I've nothing against middle-income people having less tax. Of course, we all want less tax, but there's an issue of priorities. There's a limited amount of money. And the real priority actually is to put money into the universal credit system and help alleviate some of those problems you described.
In order to help resolve some of these issues, we have to create more taxation revenue, and that money comes in, can then be used to help tackle that. The problem we've had, if you look at the drop in GDP in the past 2.5 years, it equates to something in the region of £25 billion less in taxation revenue. As the financial and banking industry is hit by the Theresa May. I mean, the banking industry, I know people don't like bankers, or bankers have earned themselves a bad reputation, but one of the things they are good at is paying huge amounts of tax.
Yeah, that's true.
And, the revenue that is, the 3.9% hit on GDP, the reduction of 3.9%, if you do the sums, and Dr. Cable, I think you're more qualified than me in economics, but I did some sums on that. 3.9% reduction in GDP, I think, is somewhere in the 20 to 25 billion pounds in taxation, drop in taxation revenue. So we're 25 billion down in the past 2.5 years. 3.9% is going to be another 25. To put this in perspective, the NHS, off the top of my head, costs about 110, 120 billion a year to run. So we're talking about pretty serious, it's a huge black holes being created in public accounts just by the effect of the best deal. The no deal of, I think it's 7.8% reduction. The government's own own calculations have indicated there'd be nearly an 8% reduction in GDP, which is, which according to my sums is somewhere in the sort of 45, 50 billion. It's nearly half the budget of the NHS wiped out. And that is actually what's going to cause the problem for Cornwall, where when we're looking for funding from government, because there's no EU funding, government are going to say, well, we'd like to give you some more, but unfortunately it's just not here.
It's quite interesting, the conversations I've had with many people around the issue of the impact that it's going to have. I'm talking to people, a group of people who are about to retire, who've paid their mortgages, who've got their pension pot in place, and you explain to them and it starts dawning on them what the consequence of Brexit is going to be. Sometimes their response to me has been, they kind of mouth the words, well, we're going to be all right. And the problem is, yes, a certain cohort of people, the better off those who've in the latter years, yes, they are going to be all right. What about the rest of them? Jill and I go and do the street food project in Penzance. We're doing it again tomorrow night. The numbers are growing, people on the streets. And not only that, that Brexit has unleashed this right-wing reaction to people who have had, who have had, the wrong end of the deal as well, and the politics of the poor have only themselves to blame are rising in our society. Thank you for the musical accompaniment, by the way, because I needed to draw that emotion up. And sorry, and then on the issue of, I don't think we've answered Paul's point about fisheries. Actually, when we've been fully engaged, we've had more influence on the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy the very significant change in 2003, and indeed the fisheries policy as well, when we changed it from production supports, for example, in agriculture, to actually public goods, and that's the direction that agriculture should be going, and not going into production support, and indeed in fisheries, going to being less dependent on quotas and more dependent on protected areas of the sea as well, and more sustainable fishery, which has been the direction in which the Common Fisheries Policy has indeed gone. It's very difficult, but there have been, the cod recovery programme has succeeded. But that's only because we've been engaged in it.
I'd just say present company accepted, Vince, but the politicians haven't done a great job so far, have they? I kind of feel that they've got us into this mess. I'm not sure that they're the ones to get us out of it. I believe that the decision should stay with the people.
I personally am not an enthusiast for referendums, because they get big, complicated issues, and you put a binary choice. That's not the way things should be. And the problem is it only happened because of the end of the coalition. We stopped it happening then. Conservatives were on their own. They had an internal civil war, and it was the only way Cameron could resolve it was by having referendums. It was their problem rather than the country's problem. We did a survey in my constituency before the 2015 election and asked people what were the most important issues on their mind that they wanted the MPs to be concerned with. And I think Europe was number 11. It was after road maintenance. It was not something, people were terribly concerned about. It was an internal Conservative Party problem. And it was a bad idea. But the problem is, now we've had it, how do you have a closure? And if the MPs were simply to say, okay, this is a complete mess, we're just going to throw the result out the window, close this down, withdraw Article 30. We may incidentally finish up doing that in February if we haven't got a solution. But if we were to do that, there would be a lot of, I think, justifiably very angry people who say, look, we were asked, we gave you a view, and now you're just throwing it out. I mean, even though I'm a strong Remainer, I would feel sympathy with a lot of the Brexit people who would feel they are being disregarded. So I think going back to them is just basic, democracy. What started with a referendum, I think, has to finish with one. But I think we've learnt our lesson. In future, we should not be resolving difficult issues in this way.